I thought what I'd do is talk a little bit about, one, I'll just tell you a little bit what I've been up to the last couple of years, then I'll talk about what I'm doing now with the Chamber and some broader thoughts on that. And then my hope was we can do a lot of Q&A, and y'all can ask me about anything. Chamber, politics, Kentucky, whatever. I'll be happy to weigh in. But it's great to be back here. When I was pulling in, one of my, as a parent, one of the scariest moments of my life was actually here in Oldham County. It's okay, because it turned out good. But I forget what year it was. My younger daughter was born in 2003. So this was probably like 2005 or 2006. I was at Oldham County Days. And we had done the parade. It was fun. It was one of my favorite. I always loved the parade and the festival. And actually, when she was a baby in '03, when I ran for Secretary of State, I marched in that parade with a baby Bjorn. And she was, at that point, big enough to turn around and face. It was great. I had like a wave her a little hand, and I'm sure I got more votes because of my cute little kid. Oh, look, he would be a great Secretary of State. He's got a cute daughter, you know. So I brought her down. It was just the two of us, and we did the parade. It was fun, and the Republican Party had a booth, and a couple doors down was like the animal shelter booth. And so she kept going over and playing with the animals, and I'd look over, and she's fine. And she had a balloon tied to her arm so I could see her, and I looked over like, there's no balloon, there's no little girl. I was like, oh my God, honey, I lost, how am I gonna explain this? I lost our daughter. And so I'm looking all over, and for like 15 seconds, I'm absolutely terrified. And then it turned out she'd just gone back. The parade was still going. She just wanted to watch the parade. She was just standing there enjoying herself, like not a care in the world. And so when I pulled up and saw the railroad track, I'm like, yes, that's exactly where I found her. But this place is great. I'm excited about the pavilions here, and I was telling somebody, what's neat about this is that not just the function, but in some respects, it looks like, in fact, one I think is an old barn, but it looks like a barn which is kind of evoking old Oldham County, but it's all new and sleek, which is new Oldham County, and it's just functional. So this is a great spot and great space, and I hope you all utilize it all the time for lots of different things in community building. So thanks for leaving the Senate race out of the bio. After I lost that Senate race, and I was trying to figure out what to do, the Institute of Politics, which was a part of the Kennedy School at Harvard, when I was an undergrad at Harvard, it was my #1 extracurricular activity. I was really involved with it. And when I got elected, I got re-engaged, and the director had left. And the Institute of Politics, the IOP as we call it, was formed when President Kennedy died. So he was a Harvard graduate. And during his life, there was some discussions about putting a library museum at Harvard for his administration and for his life. Well, as we all know, he got assassinated early. So they were sort of talking about it, but hadn't done anything concrete. And the family set up a foundation to raise money to help build this. And the plan was to put something at Harvard, a museum, a library. And early on in the discussions, they said, let's create something, because one of the president's biggest legacies was getting young people involved in politics and public service, the Peace Corps, and whether you were Republican or Democrat, it was something he was very much known for, and I think we still appreciate that legacy today. So they said, let's create a living memorial to try to get college students, especially the Harvard undergraduates, to get into politics. So in 1966, they took half the money that had been raised, which at the time was $10 million. They'd raised 20. They took $10 million, gave it to Harvard to set up the Institute of Politics. And then the plan was, we'll eventually figure out what to do with the other 10, and that'll be the library and the museum, and it'll be somewhere on Harvard's campus. And over time, the city folks in Cambridge didn't want the traffic that the museum would bring. There was actually a famous letter. They didn't want tourists in Bermuda shorts spoiling their walks on Saturday morning. So if you've ever been to Boston, you'll notice that the Library and Museum is not on Harvard's campus. It's on the water. It's actually worked out for the best. It's a beautiful spot, and it helped to rehabilitate that place. And they were probably right, maybe not about the Bermuda shorts, but there would have been a lot of traffic in Harvard Square, and I'm not sure that would have been a good idea. And so the spot where they thought it would be is now the Kennedy School of Government, which is a graduate school of public policy and administration. That's where the IOP was located. And I had this cool job for 3.5 years where my job was to try to get kids, regardless of political ideology or where they're from, interested in politics. And we invite people to come to campus for a night. We invite them to come for a semester. We help them find summer jobs. And it was just a great place. It was a great place as a political junkie. It was a great place to kind of hang out with kids. I became the unofficial ambassador to anybody who had any tie at all to Kentucky. I became their advisor. I also helped out the men's basketball program, and I would like to point out that for 3 years as their faculty fellow, those were the only 3 years since 1947 the men's team has been in the tournament. I told Coach Amaker, I said, I'm leaving now. I think you're okay, but you're on your own now. I'm going to watch it on the internet. But it was fun helping out the basketball team. And interestingly enough, the quarterback for Harvard right now, he's hurt, but the real quarterback when he gets better is from Kentucky, from Ryle High School. He started last year and starting this year until he got hurt. So it was a great experience. We had a wonderful time, but it wasn't home. And my older daughter, not the one who got lost, the older daughter, she's getting ready to start high school. And so my wife and I decided we really wanted to get back home, and fortunately for me, the job at the Northern Kentucky Chamber of Commerce was open. Now, the Northern Kentucky Chamber is different than the Oldham Chamber in this respect. We are just basically a pure chamber of commerce. The economic development functions in Northern Kentucky are actually housed at another agency. But we are a unified chamber. So 45 years ago, the Covington, Kent, and Boone Chamber, which obviously was 3 chambers that have been merged into one, merged with the Campbell County Chamber, creating a single chamber of commerce for Kent and Boone and Campbell County. And we really needed that to happen in our region. I mean, those of you who know about our region, there's 3 counties, there's 5 million cities, not quite, but close, and even a lot of school districts. It's really striking how fragmented that area. And so for 45 years, our chamber's been the voice, not just for business, but for the whole region, to try to unify the region and bring it together. When I was a kid, growing up, my father was very involved. He actually was the chair of the chamber in the mid-90s and was on a lot of different committees. And I remember when I started my professional career, he's like, there's a couple things you got to do, and one is you got to help out the United Way, and the second is what's now called, we have something equivalent to the Fund for the Arts. We have something, we used to be called the Fund Arts Fund. It's now called Artsway. You got to get involved with that, and the third thing is you got to get involved with the chamber. And so I was an early volunteer, but I wasn't that engaged when I got elected. But the chamber has played an important role and needs to play a more important role in unifying our region and helping businesses get better. Even though we don't have the official economic development role, it's really important for us to help existing businesses go stronger, whether it's through connections, networking, whether it's through introductions to people who can help them. We can do some skills development, but there are businesses who provide those services that can help, and our job is to kind of make those connections. We run a leadership program. I don't know if the Oldham Chamber runs a leadership program. I know Chris and I were talking about Leadership Louisville. We run that inside of our chamber. We also have one for high school kids, and we run that with Cincinnati. It was started about 16 years ago by actually 4 couples, husbands and wives, got together and started this youth leadership program for high school juniors, modeled after the adult leadership programs. And the city of Cincinnati folks said, hey, we want to do one too, but why don't we just join forces and let's do it together. So we run a regional youth leadership program for all of greater Cincinnati to try to develop the next generation of leaders. And then we also do some work in workforce, both on the policy side and advocacy, but also in just helping employers navigate the system of trying to find employees. So advocacy, leadership, sort of business connections, and then more broadly, not just the workforce, we advocate on everything. So we weigh in on issues. I get to now be a lobbyist. I'm not yet a legislative agent, that's the official term in Kentucky, but I'm now going to be one of those evil lobbyists, lobbying on behalf of my region and lobbying on behalf of business interests. What's been interesting for me is diving back in after having been gone for 3.5 years is, some things have cropped up. I don't know, I think this is a bit of a problem here, but we have a really bad heroin problem in Northern Kentucky. I don't know is it? Yeah, I thought it was. It was interesting, when I left 3.5 years ago, it was actually a problem. If you look at the statistics, it was a problem, but people didn't really talk about it as much. And one of the things that I'm pretty proud of, this happened before I got back to town, was how the business community stepped up and said, we got to do something about this. And whether it's lobbying the legislature for tougher sentences for the dealers, or trying to find some more beds. We have very few treatment facilities. We had nothing for adolescents in Northern Kentucky. One of our leadership classes made this a project to help get engaged, and it's causing workforce shortages. It's hard to find qualified workers who can pass a drug test, given the low unemployment rates that we have right now. And so actually the Wall Street Journal has been talking to us and talking to some of the Northern Kentucky employers about why they stepped up and why it's important to step up. And to me, it's a good example of it. There's a economic quality of life, obviously, but it's also, it's very pragmatic. You got to find workers, you got to find customers, and this drug is incredibly addictive and incredibly cheap right now. So this nasty combination of accessibility and price and potency. So that's one that was something kind of new. I mean, in the workforce thing is another one. We have a lot of manufacturing jobs in northern Kentucky. And they're advanced manufacturing. They require a fair amount of skills, and that's one of the challenges. It takes a couple of years to get those kinds of skills, and so finding some money for training or convincing companies to invest in that is a bit of a challenge. And also just convincing people that these are the kind of jobs that in 30 years are still going to be there. You know, they're not going to be offshored. You're not going to be laid off. I was talking to one of our employees whose mother, she said, her mother worked in a manufacturing plant down in southern Kentucky, and she said, you know, that was a tough lifestyle. And these plants, you can eat off the floor. I mean, they're clean, they're highly skilled, and they pay really well. They pay better than a lot of my friends from law school make right now. But we have a challenge with filling them because there's a stigma attached to them, and we're trying to figure out how to navigate that. That's another big challenge we have. I don't know if you have it necessarily here in Oldham County, but you probably have it in the metro area. The other thing I would say that's a challenge, and this kind of encompasses everything, actually, and this is, I think, same for y'all. In northern Kentucky, I'm from there, I grew up there, I love it. One of the things I love about it is I get the best of both worlds. I get Cincinnati, Ohio, so I get the Reds, and now I get the Bengals, they're good now. So the Reds and the Bengals, I get all those arts institutions and museums and symphonies and all that stuff. Get some great restaurants, and so I love being part of that metro area. I think I would, if I were in a smaller community, Louisville's not, what I don't mean by Louisville, like Lexington's small. It really is. I think I'd go crazy. But I like having the bigger metro area. I'd also go crazy in like New York, and Boston was okay sized. But I love that, but then I'm from Kentucky, you know, and I'm not even an hour from here, especially the way I drive. But you know, you're like an hour, you draw an hour and a half, 2 hour circle. You're 2 hours from Indy, Columbus, Louisville, Lexington. You can do anything in these communities. And I love the fact that I'm part of Kentucky, because it is friendlier on our side of the river. And there is a lot of beauty. And I love the horse industry. And I don't even drink bourbon, but I love the industry. You know, I have all this Maker's Mark collection. I was known as the Maker's guy up at Harvard. You know, like, aren't you tempted? I'm like, no, I don't drink it. I just collect them. So I love all that. But unfortunately, too often for us in northern Kentucky, we have instead of having the best of both worlds, we have the worst of both worlds. So we're in Cincinnati, but we're in Kentucky. We're on the other side of the river. We're in a different state. And so the local media never covers anything in Kentucky. Even the Inquirer, which covers and has a Kentucky section, they don't put the Kentucky news in the Ohio version. So they have no idea what's going on. It was very striking to me when I ran for office. For Senate, I was on Louisville and Lexington media all the time, and my job as Secretary of State, I was like never, even though I lived there, I was never in the news up in Cincinnati until I actually ran for Senate. And so we're treated differently. And then the rest of the state sometimes treats northern Kentucky differently because, well, you know, you're from Cincinnati and you talk funny. You talk like Cincinnatians. And so it's this challenge. And so I think for me, it's like, all right, let's get better integrated in Kentucky and let's get better integrated in Cincinnati. And so we are the best of both worlds. I'm a little bit fortunate, and because of my profile from politics, I have the position to maybe help facilitate that a little bit. And so we're going to try to get us better engaged. But I'll give a couple examples of how this plays out. And these are recent examples. There's an effort right now in Cincinnati called the Grand City Experiment. And it's a group of, one of the Cincinnati Chamber's leadership programs is you sign up for a class, and the class decides to do a project. Now, a lot of leadership programs, the class do a project. But this is specifically all about creating a project that will change your community. And so this group decided that they wanted to do this experiment, which was for every day, if a bunch of people signed up to commit to doing something to make the city a more pleasant place to live, would it become habit forming? And would the city, in fact, become a more pleasant place to live? I don't know how you measure all this stuff, but that's okay. And so every day you get an email if you sign up, and like today it is take a selfie with a stranger. So it's go meet somebody and take a selfie and put it in social media. Yesterday it was compliment a stranger. The day before it was listen to somebody's story. Don't just do all the talking, like I guess like I'm doing right now.
And we've succeeded.
Yeah. So I mean, this is kind of it's kind of cheesy, but it's kind of cool, right? So, but we have 375,000 people that live in Kenton, Boone, and Campbell counties. Greater Cincinnati has like 1.8 million people, something like that. It's a little bit bigger than Louisville. They didn't approach us to help market it. Now I found out about it, I tweeted about it, I got a bunch of people to sign up, but they didn't think, oh, that's really Cincinnati too. We actually have almost more people in Kenton, Boone, and Campbell than actually live in the legal city of Cincinnati. Cincinnati is kind of like Louisville in the sense that pre-merger Louisville, that it's not all that big. Same actually with Boston. You have all these other areas around it that are Cincinnati but aren't legally the city of Cincinnati, and we're part of that. So that's one example. And then another is there's this education group that was formed a few years ago with business leaders and educators, and it's a part of the State Chamber of Commerce. And there's this really cool, interesting conference on educational innovations in a couple of weeks in Louisville. I'm going to go. And I looked at it, I'm like, that's an interesting group. I've never heard of that. And it was new. It had started after I left. And I looked at the board. I'm like, wow, it's a really impressive board. And I realized there's nobody from Northern Kentucky on this board. There's like 15 people on the board. And then I'm going to send an email. I'm going to complain. Like, wait a minute. Then you're going to be on the board. And then I looked at their speakers list, and there's nobody from Northern Kentucky invited to speak. Like, they didn't think about this. They didn't look at their list and say, oh my gosh, we don't have the third most populated area of the state on here. And so I got to figure out, I got to find somebody to be on that board so when I whine that it does not have to be me, or decide if I want it to be me. But these are just examples, and as a region, it's kind of on us. You know, we have to be better engaged. We don't vote very often. We don't engage. We don't serve on boards even when asked. We don't do things like that. We don't, you know, I think a bit of an anomaly with my interaction with Kentucky. And so it's a challenge for our region. And I mention all this, I think for, you know, Oldham County is somewhat similarly situated. You know, you are part of metropolitan Louisville, but you're not part of Metro. You're not legally part of Metro Louisville, the government.
Not yet.
Not yet. And in Northern Kentucky, we wouldn't have 375,000 people if Cincinnati weren't across the river. So their success is, we're really dependent upon their success. Similarly, you know, y'all need a good Louisville. But then again, if Louisville has some challenges like in their school system, you guys are really benefiting because people want to live here because you have great schools and you know exactly where you're going to go. And one of the other jobs I looked at was actually in Louisville, and I was thinking about, could I live in Oldham County? Sure. So this is a great place to live. So, but you're tied together. Like if the city of Louisville doesn't get its act together and doesn't improve its school system, that's going to hurt the city, which will ultimately still hurt Oldham County. So it's this interesting relationship where you're not of them, but you are, but you're not, and you have to carve out your unique identity. And so we have a similar situation in Northern Kentucky. I don't know what the answer to that for us is, other than a little bit of self-help. You know, we got to improve our voting. We got to get better engaged. Kentucky is a state undergoing an interesting political transition. For years, the majority of our population lived in rural areas. Now, having lived in Boston for a few years, I still find it hard to accept the fact that I live in an urban area, given that there's a lot of grass and there's a horse farm next door to our neighborhood. But for the purposes of the urban-rural discussion, that's an urban area. And much of Oldham County is an urban area. Not all, not where David lives, but this part of Oldham County would be considered urban for these purposes. And urban and the rural areas have different priorities. So for years, the rural legislators set the priorities, and the laws were kind of structured that way. And so now the state's transitioning, and it's interesting to see how this plays out. From a population standpoint, there's now more urban than rural, but the gubernatorial and legislative leadership tends to be more reflective of the older breakdown. And what's hard about this is it's happening in a time when there's no money in Kentucky. And we've got to figure out how to prioritize and set policies to grow a little bit better. And that's what chambers can do. You know, we look to the needs of our businesses, we look to the needs of our communities. And a lot of what would help us in Northern Kentucky are law changes down in Frankfort. And I think that's the same for all of you. One of the things that happens in politics, though, I've found is that the chamber crowd can be pretty influential, but oftentimes underpunches its weight, if you will, because we talk a good game, but we don't actually show up. You know, we might show up at a meeting during the session, but we're not talking during the entire session. Where if you're an educator and you want to bend the ear of a legislator, you got to do it all. You have to engage that conversation the entire year, or that person's not going to understand you. And if you have priorities, you have to be regularly engaged, and you have to regularly, organize and support candidates and campaigns and things like that. And I think chambers tend not to do that. We're busy. We've got our businesses. We've got our families. We've got our lives. And if we could be a little bit more engaged, and this is one of the things I'm trying to do, is on the margins, get them a little bit more engaged so that we can influence, who the candidates are, and help provide support for our existing office holders who might want to advance some of our issues, but need to know that there are others, not just that there are people who actually support those issues in their districts. But it's a fun job. Every day I get to wake up and figure out how to make my hometown a better place to live, and I get paid to do that. That's pretty cool. So it's great to be home. My older daughter is a freshman in high school now. I forgot what it was like to be a freshman. They have a skit that I guess they had a pep rally a couple weeks ago, and so the seniors had a skit, and the juniors had a skit, the sophomores had a skit, and then the freshmen did. And she was part of the freshman skit, and the skit was bad. And they didn't execute it very well anyway. But it didn't matter. Like, they walked out, and now the freshman skit, all the upperclassmen, boo! Like, oh yeah, I remember being a freshman too. But they're doing great. It's fun having them back, and we're really, really enjoying it. So why don't I stop there? Please ask me any questions you possibly have. And if you could just, some of you I know and some of you I've been able to meet today, but just remind me, maybe for everybody else, just tell me your name and what your business is. Yeah, and if you go up into, every once in a while I'll get up on 42 and just drive up because it's pretty. But when you get up to Carroll County where it becomes, I shouldn't say Carroll County's not pretty, but you have some enormous industrial plants along 42 as you head up into Carroll and Gallatin counties, and I find that they're pretty but in a different way. One of the challenges is you had a mayor of Lexington and a mayor of Louisville, and there's no mayor of Northern Kentucky, so there wasn't necessarily an anchor to create this, the so-called golden triangle, but make it a manufacturing golden triangle, which is a shame because we have a ton of manufacturing jobs, and between Northern Kentucky University and University of Cincinnati and Thomas More College and Mount St. Joe's, we've got a lot of the sort of the engineering talent, and it would have been, and I think you're right, you would have seen a spur up 71. I mean, it is kind of silly though for Beam to exclude, a place where, how many people live in Oldham County right now?
16.
Yeah, that's huge, right? I mean, to exclude that many people who are essentially, most of whom orient towards Louisville, many of whom work in Louisville, probably a lot of them grew up in Louisville. So this is one of the tasks that I've been asked by my board is to try to figure out, I don't want to be the mayor of Northern Kentucky, nobody's going to be the mayor of Northern Kentucky, but in situations like that, can the chamber and can I play the role where, all right, I can be the person somebody comes to and then figure out, all right, who's the right person? Maybe they come to me and then I hand them off to the 3 judge executives of our 3 big counties. But it would be, I'm funny you asked that. I was having some conversations like, how can we be part of Beam? I mean, the flip side of that is, historically, Lexington and Louisville didn't do much together anyway. So at least that's a start. We've seen the universities partner together. I mean, it wasn't just sports rivalries, there were economic rivalries too. And when you got 2 new mayors coming in at the same time, both of whom had some business background, especially the mayor of Lexington, it was an opportunity for a new day and a new conversation. But I think if we had had somebody like that up there in Northern Kentucky, that might have helped. So I don't know if we can expand it, but that's something we're in the long run thinking about, tying everything together. Other questions? Sure, I do have an interest someday in running again. I lost my last race, but I won my first 2. Even the loss, especially in hindsight, I have some great memories. I mean, election night, not so much, but I have memories, but not necessarily great memories of election night. But I have some great memories of that campaign. I was really glad I ran, and it just wasn't meant to be. I joked. I had Senator Paul come speak. He was actually the last speaker that I helped to moderate when I was up at Harvard in April. And when I introduced him, I said, on election night, I said, we crisscrossed Kentucky from Pikeville to Paducah and Covington to Corbin, both seeking the nomination for the United States Senate. And on election night, when the votes were counted, he got a lot more votes than me. But I think we both won. He got to be United States Senator, and I got to be the director of the Institute of Politics. So it just wasn't meant to be. But I'm enjoying right now spending time with my family. I like this new job. I would love to run again someday, but I don't think somebody asked me earlier about the Senate race. No, get them to college. That might be, I'm only 42, so maybe, in a little bit. The other thing is I've blown my residency. Having lived in Boston for a couple of years. If you remember, Hunter Bates had the challenge, Oldham County resident, when he was going to be Ernie Fletcher's running mate, and he'd lived in D.C. for a couple of years, even though he worked for his Kentucky senator. And Kentucky has a 6-year residency that's pretty strict. So I don't violate the spirit of the law. I'm not a carpetbagger, but I violate the letter of the law. So I couldn't even run for governor until 2023. I could run down ticket, I guess, the next time. And then Senate or Congress, I could run whenever. But right now, my passion is this particular job. But someday I'd love to run again and serve. It was a lot of fun. Gives the ability for local jurisdictions in Kentucky to levy a sales tax for a specific purpose. The money would be kept in their community to build something. And it goes, it would have to, the legislature in Frankfort would have to pass it. It would be an amendment to the Constitution, so the voters would have to approve the amendment, and then any local additional sales tax would have to be approved by the local voters as well. Is that the right summary, Representative Osborne? Yes. Okay, so that's LIFT. And the idea is that too often locals have these ideas, these great projects, and either there's no money in Frankfort or there's no political will, or if you run it through Frankfort, like you pay the man takes a little bit off the top and sends it back. And so the idea here is you levy a tax, it basically stays in your community, and so more of that will go to the project that you need. As a chamber board, we have not weighed in on it yet. We have a very bureaucratic process, but I think we probably, it'll go before our board, I think this month maybe, and it's passed its way up. So usually usually our board approves things as they've been adopted by the Business Advocacy and Executive Committee, but right now I think the Executive Committee has approved it. I suspect the board will endorse it, but I don't actually know. And I know there's going to be a big push this legislative session to try to get it. I mean, the challenge with something like this is there's two ways to look at this. One is it's self-help. Like, all right, Frankfurt's not going to help. We're going to do this ourselves, and we're going to be more efficient. But then the flip side of that is Frankfurt can then say, well, you can do it yourself. You don't need our help. Go do a lift levy. And so some people say this just lets Frankfurt off the hook. And so that's kind of the counter argument to it. And then it's a tax, and that's a 4-letter word. So, but it's a tool that, at least it's a tool that you have. One of the things that Kentucky's Constitution doesn't do is doesn't give local governments a lot of tools to fund their operations. And so this is a tool, and with the protection of the voter approval, it's probably a good tool to have. It gives all the safeguards. If the voters of the state are okay with the concept of it and the local voters are okay with the project, then it's probably something the local community needs. It has a lot of safeguards in it. So we'll see. A lot of communities have that. And for us in Northern Kentucky, it's interesting because Ohio is very much driven by these local levies. And they have, they sunset. So you pass a property tax levy for your school, and it expires after a certain amount of time. And they're always having these campaigns. And we've seen the stadiums get built in Cincinnati by a sales tax levy in Hamilton County. There's one on the ballot this fall for the Museum Center, which is the Natural History Museum and the Children's Museum over in Cincinnati. The old Union Terminal building needs some renovation. So I suspect we're going to approve it, but that's LIFT. I know there's going to be a big push this session. It's a short session, and it couldn't go on the ballot till next year anyway. But there seems to be a lot of consensus across the state, especially I've heard a lot of chambers are supporting of this. Even if they don't have a readily identified project, they just like to have it as an option.
Our chamber has endorsed the LIFT
Yeah.
initiative. The tax is up to $1 penny, so it doesn't even have to be a penny. But we have a lot of community projects that, even the convention center, now we have some convention space and
Yeah.
possibility. But even in our business park that John is talking about, it would be nice to have a hotel type of convention center there. And that's the example that I use, that if we had that tool, we could build that type of center, and then the tax would go away when that project is done.
Right.
And that's the other thing, people don't really understand it. It does go away.
Yeah.
After it's over. But of course, we're gonna think of the next project.
Right. Right.
As we should, to grow our community.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, we have the convention center in Northern Kentucky has probably could use some expansion, and it's just a challenge. If you had some money from Frankfurt to do it, you generate more tax dollars, but it's just the money, the upfront money's not there. So a sales tax would allow you to do that because then you can bond off the tax. But that's lift. So I think this will be a big deal in the session, even though it's a short session, so this will be something to watch. The opponents call it LOST, because LOST is local option sales tax. But the proponents call it lift. It'll lift up your community.
Local initiative.
Yes, local initiative for, yeah. Yeah, I thought that T was tax, local initiative for tax. The LI, I think, is that, but we'll see. Other questions?
Who do you think are yet to announce to be governor or get in the governor's race, democratically or Republican?
So there are a couple of Republicans that are sort of bigger names that are circling. Matt Bevin. I saw somebody with a Matt Bevin sticker on their car in the parking lot. Bevin, I could see getting in the race on the Republican side. Kathy Bailey, who was the former U.S. ambassador to Latvia, lives in Louisville. She's pondering it. And Supreme Court Justice Will T. Scott from Pike County is thinking about it. My guess is Bevin gets in and probably Scott and Bailey don't. And that's probably it among the Republican field, sort of big names. So that's 3. On the Democratic side, right now, Jack Conway is it. My suspicion is that somebody will run against him because he seems like, I'm not saying he's an easy target, I'm just saying that like, if you run, you can win, and that somebody could step up and try to run a campaign against him because he's a strong candidate for the party, but he's not like Hillary Clinton is in the presidential where she can basically beat anybody right now in the Democratic Party. And so I suspect somebody will run against him. One of the thoughts I have is that Dan Monjardo will come back. And because he's the kind of person with a name ID and having been lieutenant governor and having run a couple statewide races, he could probably get in with a little bit of a later start. There's also an argument for some outsider, business person to come in. Outsiders are pretty popular in politics right now, especially.
What about Luther Deaton?
That's one. Well, my dad. So my dad works for Luther Deaton, so I don't know anything about this. Just as an FYI, but I just thought I'd disclose it. He runs Central Bank in northern Kentucky. I was thinking about that kind of profile, somebody like a Luther Deaton. Who I'm sure is probably toying with it, but I don't know how seriously he is thinking about it. But there is some value in an outsider coming in into that race. So we'll see how it plays out. I mean, we'll have to look and see how these elections turn out this year. It's an interest. I mean, I'm 42 years old. We've had 4 years of Republican governors in my lifetime, and in a state that's. But the flip side of this is, other than Wendell Ford, the state hasn't elected a Democrat to the Senate since 1978. So this is a state that at the federal level has become pretty red, but the Democrats do a pretty good job of nominating and winning these races. So my gut would say you'd have to say that the state's probably trending Republican, and that the Republican would have a pretty good shot in 2015. But you just don't know, and especially if it's a nasty 3-way primary and Jack kind of escapes a primary, that you just never know. But it's going to be interesting for me to watch because I know all these candidates pretty well. In Northern Kentucky, Jamie Comer's running mates as a state senator named Chris McDaniel. He's from Northern Kentucky. He's young and new. You all probably wouldn't know him necessarily, but we really like him. We were joking. It'd be nice to have a Northern Kentucky lieutenant governor, but it'd be also nice to have a Northern Kentucky head of A&R, and he could have been the head of A&R, but he chose to run for lieutenant governor. So we're watching that closely, and I served with Jack Conway, and I know Hal Heiner pretty well. I don't really know Matt Bevin because he wasn't as involved before I left. But I suspect Bevin. If you look at the polls, Bevin should get in the race. He polls pretty well. But we'll see. It'll be an interesting year, and there'll be, just like this year with the U.S. Senate race, between the governor's race and then Senator Paul probably running for president. The nation's political eyes are on this state. It was kind of fun up at Harvard. All these reporters calling me and asking me for insights, and then also like, where can we go get some good barbecue when we're in your state? All the important questions. And so the combination of the Senate, a governor. There's only 2 competitive governor's races next year because Mississippi will be a reelect, and so it's just us in Louisiana. And so the nation's eyes will be on Kentucky for not just basketball, but also politics. Other questions? Great. Well, thanks for the invitation. It's great being back in Oldham County. Great to see so many familiar faces, and I hope you all have a great weekend.